Ready? Yeah. Okay.
Oh, okay. Good morning, everybody. It's morning here in Spain. It's morning in Reading, where Kelsey is joining us from as well. And whatever time of the day it is with you, hope you're having a fabulous time. It is our first webinar of 2023, and I'm really excited to have Kelsey joining us again. She and her colleague Gonzalo gave us a talk last year about another Erasmus project that they were working on, use a grammar for spontaneous communication, and I'll share a link to that one. But today she's here to talk to us about another communicative skills project around using formulaic language. So really looking forward to the session. Over to you, Kelsey.
Okay. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for having me again. I love being able to talk about our projects, and I really care a lot about this one personally because I wrote it and I did my master's dissertation on this topic. So I'm really passionate about it and happy to be here to share a little bit about it. So yeah, as Teresa mentioned, we're going to be talking about the concept of formulaic language and how to use it as a teaching tool. And then I'm going to tell you a little bit about our project and what we're making with that. So first of all, just to give you an overview, I'm not sure if all our viewers are familiar with the concept of formulaic language, but basically native speakers tend to recycle the same phrases over and over. These phrases are called formulaic sequences. So these formulaic sequences are actually stored and retrieved as whole units in the brain. So when we say things like, by the way, and go ahead and stuff like that, our brain actually analyzes that as one word, and not as one word, but one unit, you know what I mean? So it makes communication a lot easier when you're able to understand and produce these types of phrases that are used over and over every day by native speakers. These phrases are often actually almost always situation specific as well. Like you would only say the phrase by the way in a very specific situation where you want something to appear as an afterthought, for example. And they are often opaque in meaning you can't really understand them by analyzing them as individual parts. I'm going to stick with analyzing the phrase by the way again, just because I already mentioned it, but the words by, the, and way do not mean individually what they mean as a whole. So this type of speech actually makes it really difficult for learners to analyze and to be able to understand these phrases. And I'm sure if you've tried to learn a language as well, then you've probably have found it pretty difficult to understand all these little phrases, but you probably also realize how useful they are when it comes to learning a language. And actually some research estimates that over 80% of speech when we're speaking is formulaic. So this is like a power that we can kind of harness to be able to understand better and teach our students to have better communication skills. So continuing on with what formulaic language is, it's an umbrella term for different kinds of fixed expressions. Like I said, they're often non-literal in meaning, and they often have a specific communicative function. So a few types of formulaic language are collocations, which are two words that always are found together. I just give a couple of examples here of adjective and noun collocations: strong coffee, heated argument. So in this one, strong coffee, we don't mean that the coffee has a lot of physical strength. So it might sound a little bit odd to a non-native speaker, but this is how we refer to coffee that has a lot of flavor, for example. We also have multi-word verbs, like pick up, pick out, pick on. These all have different meanings. Even phrasal prepositional verbs like put up with, for example, if you analyze those individually, you really can't arrive at what the meaning means. So it's important to teach these explicitly to learners. We also have idioms and proverbs like bite the bullet, and that's a piece of cake. Again, it's not talking about physically biting a bullet, so this could be really hard for a learner to understand what it means without being taught explicitly. We also have pragmatically useful expressions, and in linguistics, it's known as situation-bound utterances. So I've already mentioned the one, by the way. Then we have things like see you later, which we don't really mean that we're going to see the person later. We mean that we'll see them at another time. Or you're kidding me. We just mean, wow, I can't believe that. Not like, oh, you're such a jokester, you know. And then we also have something called lexicalized sentence stems, which are kind of like sentence frames, like this, like the structure, would you mind, verb ing, to express politeness when making a request. So that is just a little brief overview of formulaic language. And as you could see, it is a really significant part of language, but that could also be very hard for learners to understand. So based on the research that we've done on this topic, it's really clear that there's a lot of benefits to teaching formulaic language, and there's a lot of research to back this up as well. So teaching formulaic sequences, and this is also known as teaching language in chunks. And I think the word chunks is hilarious, by the way, but anyway, fluency can be increased by teaching formulaic language because it eases the speed of processing and speaking, because these phrases are stored as whole units. So if you hear a set of words, but you understand them as one unit, it makes the processing instantaneous rather than having to try to analyze each individual word. And it also makes speaking easier because you can express more of a complex thought than your language level allows you to, if you're aware of some of these phrases before you get to that grammatical level. Another benefit is that it can increase somebody's pragmatic competence by learning these situation-bound utterances. I'm going to stick with my same example of by the way, because it just keeps things consistent, but this is one good example of a situation-bound utterance that you would have to hear in context a few times in order to be able to understand. But then once you hear it a few times, you probably know in which situation you should learn or use this phrase. And finally, it can also help with the acquisition of grammar. And it actually allows people with a low level of language to use more complex structures than their level will allow them to. So you don't really need to understand the grammar to be able to use these phrases. For the example, the would you mind structure can be given to learners as a polite sentence starter, even in like the A2 level, for example, but they don't necessarily know that would is a modal verb, and they don't really know the whole structure of all of it, but they can just know that this is a polite way to start a request and that you don't just demand things from people. So there's tons of benefits to it. Like I mentioned, I'm super passionate about it. So this is like a non-exhaustive list. I could talk all day about this, but I'm not going to.
Do you think as well, is there a difference between teaching formulaic language to young learners and adults? Because I completely agree that you can introduce chunks with A2 learners, but perhaps they're much more likely to question it and kind of want to know what all those different parts mean, maybe, than a younger learner who might just go, okay, I can spurt that out.
Yeah, I definitely noticed that. And even with senior learners, especially, they tend to have a lot of questions about why things are the way they are. And it's what I would just say is like, don't worry about it. We'll get to it later. Not everybody is accepting of that type of response, but you could just confuse them if you tried to explain something above their level. So yeah, I agree with you there, though. It's much easier to teach this way to children, in my experience. So what can happen if learners don't acquire formulaic language? There's a few negative effects that can occur. One of them is obviously difficulty understanding and being understood by native speakers. And I'll give you an example because this also happens between dialects. It doesn't only just happen between languages. If you couldn't hear, I am from the US, but I live in the UK. And when I first came to the UK, even I couldn't really understand what people were saying sometimes. Like if I would go out to a restaurant or a fast food place and they would say, eat in a takeaway. And they just say it so fast. And it's just something that they say every single day, like one unit. But I had to like listen closely and analyze each part of that phrase because as I know it is for here or to go. So I was having difficulty understanding people. And if I spoke the way that I normally spoke, people couldn't understand me either. So if this happens even between dialects, imagine how different it is between languages. So it's something that can really hinder your understanding if you're in the target language community. Another issue could be a lack of socio-linguistic understanding, and this has to do with pragmatics. So you might not be able to understand the nuances of politeness or formality without understanding the formulaic structures that go along with them. Like the example I gave before, would you mind doing something, is a polite way of asking or of making a request. But if you don't know that, then you don't really understand the polite level that that sentence holds. And you might be too formal in certain situations or too informal where you should be formal and so on. And then this can also happen is that you might be perceived negatively by the target group community. And this has to do with the in-group, out-group bias in psychology, but it's connected with language as well, because in-group language can be used as a bonding tool. So to give another example, in the UK, they often greet people with the phrase, "You all right?" And I didn't understand that at first either. And I would always say, "What's up?" In a casual conversation. So people didn't understand me and they didn't know how to respond to "what's up." So I would say, "Oh, hey, what's up?" to somebody casually. And they would say, "Fine, thanks. How are you?" or something, you know. Or if somebody said to me, "Are you all right?" I would just be like, "Yeah, why? Am I bleeding? Do I look hurt? Like, is there something wrong with me?" So if you don't understand those words and phrases that people use as a bonding tool, then you are part of the out group, and it's hard to break into that without speaking the way that people around you speak. So yeah, basically not knowing formulaic language can hinder people's communicative competence by a lot. So now just getting into formulaic language as a teaching tool. There's a few different ways that you can incorporate this into your lessons. I would say one of the major things that all teachers should be doing is incorporating authentic materials into their lessons to give students that native-like input that's required for communicative competence. So just in case anybody in the audience doesn't know, authentic materials are text and videos that come directly from the target language community, but are not designed for language teaching. So these are things like if you go on vacation in Ireland and you bring back a newspaper that Irish people would read, then that's an authentic material. It's not designed for teaching, but if you read it, you're gonna see exactly how people speak in that target language community. And these authentic materials could be really great for analyzing the use of formulaic language, especially the socio-pragmatic aspect of it. There's also something called noticing. I think this was coined by a researcher called David Wood, but don't quote me on that. But noticing activities for fluency can mean introducing a student to a phrase, then having the student exposed to some authentic material and be able to notice when this phrase is used, and thus be able to analyze the context in which it is used. And in that way, they can also acquire that phrase themselves. And then it actually makes them able to speak a lot faster if they have chunks of words that they can rely on, that they know are grammatically accurate, and that they also know the situation which they should be used in. So noticing is really great for fluency. We can also analyze the grammar of phrases. As I mentioned before, sometimes learners are able to use phrases that are a little bit above their language level. So when they finally do reach that level, it's actually a really great tool to be able to analyze the grammar of why that phrase is structured the way it is. Like going back to the would you mind structure, if you teach this to an A2 learner, once they get up to the B1 or B2 level, they can finally realize like, oh, would is a modal verb, and the whole structure of that sentence. So that helps them acquire grammar as well. And then finally, a good activity to do for the socio-pragmatic aspect of it is role playing for situation-bound utterances and pragmatics. So one activity that I've done, which my students have had a lot of fun with, I did this in while teaching teenagers, just for context. I would introduce them to like 10 different idioms and then break them into small groups and have them create a role play or a dialogue to perform to that class using that idiom. Then the rest of the class can analyze whether the idiom was used in the correct context or not. Idioms, this is a side note, idioms are also great because you can analyze why they, I don't know how I should word this. You can analyze the individual words of an idiom and come to the conclusion of what it means. You can look into the historical context and think like, why did people start saying that? Why did somebody ever say bite the bullet? And then why did it catch on? And what does it mean, type of thing.
And I think as well, that's the sort of language that our learners are really interested in sometimes. The kind of the stories behind words and phrases can get them really motivated.
Exactly. And a lot of times it's funny too, because you don't really think about it. Like the phrase break a leg, why on earth would somebody say that? But then if you learn the story, it's actually like a funny story behind it. So yeah, I agree. It's a fun thing for learners.
And I was thinking as well, when you were mentioning both the kind of the authentic materials and noticing, there's a couple of sites, I think Youglish, and there was another one, playphrase.me, but I think you have to pay for that one now, where you could type in a phrase and then it would throw out loads of YouTube examples of that phrase in use. So
that's amazing.
yeah. I mean, it sometimes they weren't always particularly interesting contexts. It could be kind of a university lecture, or it could be a TV show, or it could just be somebody doing a reaction video. But that's another way of introducing your students to that formulaic chunk. I like chunks.
Yeah, it's a funny word, right? Yeah, I have to look into that. I've never heard of that tool, but that sounds incredibly useful.
I'll try and add a link to it on the chat afterwards.
Yeah, thank you. Perfect. Okay, so one more thing to say about formulaic language as a teaching tool is that there's a distinct lack of materials that teach formulaic language explicitly in most English language teaching, like textbooks and stuff like that. So a lot of textbooks largely ignore formulaic language, aside from a focus on phrasal verbs. Of course, in English textbooks, there's always going to be phrasal verbs, but there's not a lot of this English in use like that you would see in the English file books, for example. And the thing is that formulaic language is often an afterthought when really it should be the focus, in my opinion. So it seems like an afterthought because you might have an entire lesson on how to use a specific grammar point, and then it'll have one paragraph like language in use at the bottom, and it's just like how people would actually use this in their daily lives. But to me, if you want to learn to communicate, the main focus should be these phrases that people use every single day. So that's my strong opinion about formulaic language. Now moving on to the project that we created around this. It's an Erasmus Plus project. It's titled Improving Communicative Competence in Foreign Languages from a Distance. The rationale behind the project was that during the pandemic, because this started about 2 years ago, during the pandemic, people didn't have the opportunity to interact with people that much unless it was online, but a lot of people wanted to learn a foreign language to upskill themselves to be more marketable for the job market. But it's almost impossible, I would say, to learn a language without that human interaction. So we came up with this project idea to make up for the lack of formulaic language teaching resources there are out there, and to be able to give people a way to learn communicative competence a little bit better without having to interact with anybody. So the way that we did this was to write a methodology handbook for teachers, which is available on the project website, which I'll share with you. So the handbook goes really in depth into each of the topics that I talked about today, the benefits of learning formulaic language, what it is, and how you can teach it. And it also contains practical activities at the end. So there's, I can't remember, I think it's about 5 activities though that teachers can use immediately right in their classrooms. And it also bases lessons around authentic materials and all the things I mentioned before. The main result, I guess, would be the second one, which is an app for learners. And the app is going to be really cool. It's not available soon. I mean, it's not available now, but it will be soon. And the app, the user is going to be able to go on their phone. They should select English, and then they have a selection of videos from YouTube, which are authentic sources. So for example, one is a scene from the show Friends, and you have the transcript on the bottom of the screen, and the formulaic phrases appear highlighted in the transcript. So then you can click on the phrase, see the meaning, and then at the end there's a quiz. So the user gets to see these phrases used in context. And it's also a bit of cultural education too, because these videos come from all over the world. They come from the US, the UK, Australia, everywhere. So the app is the main result, I would say. And then the last one is an open educational resource for teachers that provides practical teaching materials for formulaic language. Now, this isn't ready yet either, but when it is, the teacher is going to be able to go on, choose the level that they're teaching, and then choose from a range of formulaic language focuses, including collocations, idioms, multi-word verbs, etc. And from that, then they'll be able to have a list of freely available resources online that teach that specific aspect of formulaic language. So it is fun.
This open educational resource, are these resources that the project has created or that you're curating?
We're finding them online, yeah. So these aren't ones that we created from scratch. We're kind of analyzing everything that's out there and trying to compile the best ones.
And when you started the project, did you have the idea of the app as the end product in mind, or did that come up through the work that you were doing?
Yep, the app was always the plan because I thought, like, there's nothing really that you can do. You could go on YouTube, you could go on Netflix and use the subtitles, but when you see a phrase that appears and you don't know what it means, how do you find out what it means unless you specifically look it up? So app was always part of the plan for sure.
Oh, cool. Sounds really exciting.
Right? I'm pretty excited about it. I hope it comes out good. So just a little bit more about the project. We have 3 objectives. One is to create a set of easily accessible teaching and learning materials that support communication skills in a foreign language. We also want to promote the uptake of an effective teaching methodology across Europe, because a lot of teachers don't really seem to know about this approach. at least in my experience, or they might know about it peripherally, but not make it a main part of their teaching. And then we want to upskill foreign language teachers in providing formulaic language-based lessons for their students. Because even if a teacher does know what it is, they might not necessarily have time or feel like structuring a whole lesson around it. So we want to make it easy for teachers to be able to find these materials that are floating around out there. So these are the project partners. They are a variety of different language schools from around Europe, except for the Greek team, who is the technology developers. So they're developing the app and the platform, and all the other partners, including us, are providing different language inputs. So all of these project results will be available in English, Spanish, Italian, Latvian, Russian, and German.
So does that mean the app will be available for language learners of these different languages?
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
Right?
I'll use it for German.
Yeah, I took a look at the prototype and I'm learning Spanish, so I was trying to do it as well. It's useful so far. So if anybody's curious and wants to take a look and learn a little bit more about the project, we have a project website, icom-erasmus.site, and then we also have a Facebook and a LinkedIn page. And I just wanted to say that the presentation today and the project rationale is based on extensive research of over 30 publications on the topic of formulaic language. So it's not something that I pulled out of thin air. That's a good formulaic phrase. But if you're interested in the research, just send me an email at erasmus@eurospeak.ac.uk, and I can share you a list of the resources. I just didn't have space to include it in the presentation. Yeah.
So cool. I was thinking as well, just with you mentioning about formulaic language and chunks and things, is there been research done on second language acquisition and kind of, because obviously we, as you say, we have a lot of chunks that we use in our own language, but we're not teaching our students to learn language that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. So like I mentioned before, there's a huge lack of that in English language teaching, and it's really unfortunate because, as you mentioned, we have phrases that we use so often. So a lot of research does say that, yes, it's really a solid teaching tool for communication, but it's just not a popular method at the moment. So I'm trying to push for the popularity of this method.
No, I mean, it sounds so exciting. And I think as well, I mean, obviously the app for language learners and also for teachers is really good. But as you were saying about having that resources or kind of the ability to go and think, what is formulaic language? Like, what do I want to teach my students? What can I teach them today? Even if it's just kind of, a 10-minute section that you build on each lesson. I think that's really cool having that resource available for people.
Yeah, exactly. Thanks. And there's a lot of stuff out there that is not, let's say, super accurate. So we've done a lot of vetting of these sources too. So they are all going to be sources that are very legitimate and accurate in terms of language teaching.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And I mean, in an ideal world, what changes would you like to see to coursebook materials or syllabi to really start including more formulaic language?
For example, I would love to see verbs taught in the context that they're used, because many verbs in English are used with the preposition. But when we teach verbs, we teach them on their own. So for example, the verb to marry, is, it's very understandable. There's marriage in every culture, but in a lot of languages, they say get married with, but in English, we say get married to. And that's something so simple that if you've seen it in context enough times, you would know that the preposition is to and not with. So that's one example of something I'd like to see if I could write a textbook.
Yeah, I've always been a big fan of kind of chunks. And, you know, even just when you're introducing vocabulary with young learners, teaching them kind of it's a pencil, just to get them used to using a phrase rather than just a single word.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome. Well, we haven't had any questions come in so far. We had an interesting comment from Anthony quite early on about how sometimes poor use of expressions such as by the way cause problems in online communication.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And that was something I was thinking about actually as well when you were mentioning before about like you're kidding me. How much emphasis do you put on the intonation patterns when you're teaching the formulaic language?
Oh, yeah, that's a good point. I would say, again, if you've heard something in context enough times, then it could be something that happens automatically, but this isn't the case for every learner. And I personally do teach intonation when I teach these phrases because, yeah, it would sound kind of weird if you're like, you're kidding me. You have to say, you're kidding me, you know, it's different. Changes the whole meaning, actually.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. And I loved your story as well about the eat in or take away. Yep.
We're so many
Yeah.
of these things when I first got here.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. And there are things as well that, you know, we don't learn in our own language. Like, you know, you learn them through exposure. Like, you know,
Yeah.
a lot of American series. So then you hear, what was it, eat here or take out? Or
We're here to go. Yeah.
So exposure, lots of exposure to authentic materials to get our students using that language. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kelsey, for coming along today. I'm really looking forward to the app when it comes out. So do feel free to kind of post a message in the hub when it's out. And I'm sure everybody will look forward to using it, whether to learn languages themselves, like me for German, or pass it on to their students. Cool. Okie dokie. Well, have a lovely day, everyone. And we'll be back again in another couple of weeks with another webinar and back next Thursday with coffee breaks. So have a fabulous week.
Thanks for having me.